I was half an hour into my third flight today. At least this one was almost over. It had started 14 hours ago, flying from DC to Cape Town. There I caught a flight to Novo Air Base in the Antarctic. And we were now flying west along the Myuuji Mountains to a small camp set up by the US military. There was a recent discovery, and as a frequent business associate, I was called in to consult. I was briefed quickly, a flood of information compacted down. A World War II base had been discovered, hidden in a deep valley under a mountain. It had the name Festung 212 carved into the rock above the entrance. Festung was German for fortress, no question who it belonged to. There was said to be a massive weapons cache, and they wanted high-level opinions on them, so I would appraise them and categorize, perhaps even reverse engineer certain tech, if it somehow surpassed ours, or it was a theoretical consult. They would want theories of types of weapons that the Germans could have below, if they hadn't already investigated. Guessing the types of weaponry the Germans would have is kind of like guessing what type of ammo a shooter's gonna use. It's limited but varied. We basically know the limits of their tech, because we had faced it in battle. But that was the thing with the Nazis. They experimented. I had studied Nazi warfare and the different categories of weaponry they used. I had also studied how they had been attempting to harness black magic to blend with modern technology. They weren't anchored down by morals or ethics, right or wrong, good or evil. In their eyes, they were the good and they were destroying the evil. I had read that Hitler sent out massive exploration parties to various parts of the globe, searching for mythical artifacts, lost civilizations, advanced but abandoned. Anything that could give the Krots answers or an edge in warfare. We were lucky they hadn't discovered anything, as far as we knew. Now I'm what you call a weapons engineer. I won't go into my education, but it's extensive and involves engineering and biotech. I was poached young, groomed and built to create psych ops and mass casualty military tech. I started a private firm called String Control. We didn't advertise online. We designed ways to destabilize nations for private corps and equity firms. We used a variety of methods, from social to technological, to pharmaceutical to political, to 2 million other tactics that we had up our sleeves. Our previous contract was with a Southeast Asian country trying to invade and take over another country without using any physical force. We looked into the target country and found 3/4 of its economy was based on agriculture, so we simply needed to control the weather. Now, this might seem like a conspiracy theory idea, but it's real science. The Saudi Arabians have been adapting it for years. It's referred to as a cloud seeding, and uses drones to force precipitation with electrical charges. There are other ways of doing this, like adding substances through chemtrails, such as silver iodide, to existing clouds to induce rain, or even snow. But with flooding, the news of the disaster would enter the national stage and other countries would send help. We had to avoid that. So we designed a system of drones to perform the opposite. For 2 months, the target country didn't receive a drop of rain. Their economy crumbled as no one could grow or sell or eat, and the target government caved and agreed to all terms. After the target had signed on the dotted lines, our employer paid us to flash flood the country for 2 days anyways, just out of spite. It was disgusting, certainly, but I figured I'd be getting hired by another country to take this one out soon enough, and I looked forward to that day. I also had a lexicon of contacts for old World War II weapons and paraphernalia, buyers and collectors, and not the ones you would find in the yellow pages. But this felt bigger than that. This felt secretive on a dangerous level. I thought back to the Germans. I wondered what type of weapons they were working on, how advanced they were for their time. It wasn't just the artillery that I was interested in seeing. I was hoping to take a look at some of their labs. I was fascinated with their experiments. What was he working on next, though? Genes, gases, viruses. What a horrible man he was. They all were. I sat back exhausted. It wasn't just the flights or the time changes. I was burned out with work and had been planning to walk away for some time. My conscience was starting to catch up to me. Something I thought I had shrunken down to the subatomic level and buried in lead. I thought about some of the horrible things that I had been hired to do in the past. My mind was regurgitating it all more lately, like I was in confession with myself. One of my first contracts was with a pharmaceutical company, lacing dormant but aggressive strains of meningitis in vitamin shots. We were given carte blanche by the observing medical bodies because they had a meningitis treatment regimen nearing release, so we played a little bit of God. We tested other illnesses and diseases and made some frightening discoveries. If you give a certain percentage of the population a debilitating illness, it becomes genetic. If they have kids, they'll get it and pass it on too. There's a reason you see it all a lot more today than in the past. It's not just because the population's grown. And then I moved on to pediatrics, but I won't go into that. That's what causes me the most nightmares. The snow and cold hit me in the face the second the airplane door opened and I stepped out. Even with a thick multi-clava and scarf, this was a different kind of chill. My shoulders shot up, touching my ears. We were directed to a series of snowmobiles that took us to another, even smaller camp. There, we were given snowshoes and had to hike to the rocky summit of the Myuuji Mountain, a few hundred meters away. I could see a muted orange glow coming from what appeared to be a large doorway at the end of the footpath that we were following. It wasn't a door, but it was an entrance carved into the rock. It led into a tunnel lined with mining lights. We followed our guides as the path curved and winded and took us deeper under the mountain. Our guides began taking off their gloves, hats, and jackets. What were they doing? Wouldn't it be getting colder the deeper that we went? I passed several explosive charges attached to support beams throughout the tunnel. The explosives looked old and had German writing on them. Our guides informed us that they were connected to other explosive charges set up at strategic points throughout the mountain, to collapse in on itself if needed. Why would that be needed, I thought. Our path curved ahead, and I felt warmth on my face. We turned a corner and found ourselves in a massive open cave. What was I looking at? The cave was lit by pot lights pointed up. They sent frightening, jagged shadows up the walls to the stalactites hanging down. But I saw green, so much green. This far north, all you see is white and gray. But this resembled something closer to a botanical garden. There were luscious vegetation and a pond. The long stalactites hanging from the roof of the cave were covered in foliage. Our guide saw my shocked face and told me that we were in a geothermal pocket. The mountain was lined with them and they were rich in vitamins and minerals, so they sustained multiple types of hot springs and plant life, even without photosynthesis. But the greenery wasn't what held my attention any longer. At the far end of the overwhelming cave, a gargantuan ancient statue of a bearded, Herculean-like hero keeping evil at bay was carved into the rock. The statue's hand was pressing what appeared to be a large creature's head into the ground. It was like a hawk but with teeth, or a dragon. The longer I stared at the statue, the more the word God seemed the only fitting way to describe it. In front of the statue, a small portable had been set up, and that's where we were headed. Our guide told me to follow him in his steps specifically as we moved through the flora. I stopped and touched one of the plants but hadn't seen anything like it before. It had multiple veins of varying colors running through it. There were a half-dozen scientists and military personnel sprinkled throughout the cave, some with metal detectors. Oh crap, they were looking for landmines. I followed our guide's footsteps perfectly. We entered the portable. Inside there was a large freight elevator, a mix of old German technology and our updated modern type. Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan stood by it, ready to debrief me. But first, he recommended that we stick to the approved path and hallways. The Germans had left booby traps. In the first 2 days of discovery, 5 scientists and 3 soldiers had died from a variety of old tripwires and nail bombs. It had been messy, but they believed it was safe now. Great. Stick to the paths and hallways, got it. Sullivan moved on. The elevator was in fact built by the Germans, but the military believed the hole it went into had been discovered by them, not formed. The hole dropped 13 kilometers straight down into the earth. At the depth of 4 kilometers, there was an elevator switchover, which dropped another 5. And there, an additional elevator switchover was needed for the final 4 kilometers to reach the hole's depth of 13 clicks. The elevator was the only way up or down, though there was a second tunnel up that ran parallel to the first switch, but it looked to be dug by the Germans as a backup route. It appeared they hadn't moved on to dig any for the next 2 levels, at least from what had been found. This pathway was located just to the side of the elevator platform at the first switchover, and was said to take between 4 and 5 hours to climb to the surface, in a very cramped and slanted crawl space. We were given heat-repellent suits, and instructed to stay inside the compounds at all times upon reaching the bottom level, which was where we were headed. How the heck was there a naturally formed hole that went this deep? Maybe the Germans really had discovered something. As we rode down, my first thought was this was being used as a massive missile silo. 13 kilometers down though, what kind of tech did they really have? Or worse, find? What if they discovered a new type of energy source? Something that dwarfed enriched uranium and fission capability and output. I got chills. It reminded me of the most dangerous weapon that I had ever heard of that was thankfully never used. The weapon was part of Project Pluto, a nuclear R&D division of the US military, and was referred to as SLAM, as in supersonic low-altitude missile. It was massive, and in order to reach ramjet speed, it would need to be launched by conventional rocket boosters from the ground. After reaching cruising altitude in unpopulated areas near the target, a nuclear core would be made critical. It would then have unlimited range from its energy source, and cruise in circles until it was ordered down to the deck. That meant the SLAM, which would be carrying a mass payload of nuclear weapons, would turn the cruise missile into an unmanned bomber and deliver all of its warheads to the targets in an unwavering storm. But it didn't end there. After the payload was delivered, the missile could then spend weeks flying over nearby populated areas at low altitudes and cause massive shock waves and deadly radiation that would destroy entire cities. If and when the missile went down, it would spew deadly radiation for hundreds of years to the surrounding areas. Someone had actually thought of using this. There was no way the Germans had gotten that far though. We changed onto the next elevator, which was located on a platform directly below us. The hole was said to be perfectly straight, going down through earth, ice, rock, and granite. As we rode the second elevator down, I watched the walls passing and noticed that they weren't digging or claw marks or anything. This really was naturally formed. We changed over to the third and final elevator. I started to think about what the hole had been used for. Sacrifice. It might be naturally formed somehow, but the statue in front of it was carved by man. It reflected us after all. Now I wondered if there were more statues where we were headed. There couldn't be. It'd be too hot without suits, unless they, whoever they were, had found a way. We arrived at the bottom of the hole, which opened up to a large cavern with multiple German-built facilities inside. There was a large weapons cache and depot, a series of laboratories and multiple bunking dormitories spread through large open caverns in the earth. Apparently, there were stockpiles of canned food and supplies to last decades down there. I couldn't believe that I was actually here. I wasn't aware of anyone who had descended this far. Even now, 80 years later, I had only heard of the coldest super deep in Russia in the 80s, reaching 12 clicks before it was shut down. Mysterious circumstances and subterranean sounds was the byline for the closure, if I recall correctly. It hadn't been drilled or dug through rock and granite and earth though. The cola had been strategically placed to take advantage of permafrost below the surface. Ice was far easier to drill through than rock and granite, and it had taken them years to dig. And this was deeper. We appeared to be in another geothermal pocket, but the plants were all purples and reds and oranges here. The steam rose from fissures on the ground like hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean. I stared out the tiny windows of the compound, unbelieving the life that could survive down here at this depth with this heat. I was directed to the bunk rooms where I would be sleeping when and if I needed it. Sullivan then brought me to the weapons cache where it had already been swept for booby traps. That made the crater in the pit of my stomach a little bit smaller. I was still thinking about the 8 men who had died in the first 2 days. Naturally, I had been wondering if the Nazis had used some kind of trigger and gear traps. I would love to take a look at their handiwork, but we would start with the nuclear arsenal. Apparently, the Uran Project, which was the name for Germany's nuclear tech research, had not in fact harnessed nuclear. They had stockpiled hundreds of bombs though, the largest being the SC-2500s. Big guys too. It looked like there were a few dozen of them down here. And then there were the various PCs and SBs, all measures of aerial bombs. But the scary thing about them was, they were all open. They had been wired together and connected to what appeared to be some kind of kill switch. I was willing to guarantee they would still detonate if triggered. What many don't know about the German bombs were about 10% of them never exploded. Many, in fact, would be buried under the rubble from under explosions going off. Namely, in England during the Battle of Britain. The bombs could sit there, some duds but others live, for decades, even being built on top of and not go off. But then the slightest vibration just might. I had been given 2 assistants, who I sent off to begin inspecting the arsenal, pre-defusing. I just wanted time in here to myself, and so I walked through the aisles inspecting all the firearms, the bombs and explosives that had never been used. I was eyeing the Mauser carabiners, the MP40s, the MG42s. It was all a pretty big letdown. These were all old weapons and nothing I wouldn't find in a high school textbook. It was all interesting, but what a disappointment. I picked up one of the Mausers, pulled back the bolt and checked it. Loaded, ready to be fired. I put it back down in the pile of other rifles, but caused them to shift and fall. The whole pile tumbled behind the shelf, knocking a wall panel loose. Miss Sullivan rushed over and found me putting the rifles back onto the shelf. I told him everything was fine and that I had just been a bit clumsy. I went back to looking through the weapons shelves, but the wall panel was stuck in my mind. There was something behind it. Sullivan and the assistants eventually called it a day, so we packed up and went to the dormitory. I unpacked and laid in bed for about an hour. All I could think about was the wall panel. What was behind it? I had to know. I snuck out of the dorm and back to the weapons hall. I made my way through the aisles of 12-foot shelves and found the rifles. There was the wall panel. I pushed it inward and found a small ramp that led to a tunnel under the floor. Screw it. I got on my flashlight and crawled into the tunnel. There was just enough room to stand up, and I led back towards the elevator but under it. I followed the path all the way to the end and saw the last thing that I was expecting. There was a door. Old wood, metal plates and handle, expensive, classic, and well-crafted. Something you would see in an upper-class hotel, only abandoned and weathered by time and environment. I fought with myself to open it and decided to. If there was a booby trap, then so be it. I wanted to know. It was a large room that looked like a combination office and library. It was filled with Nazi paraphernalia and old German books and photographs. An oil canvas painting with Hitler hung from the wall. There was a wine rack, an old record player, and a collection of vinyls. Was this to be Hitler's last stand? And did he just never make it here? I thought about cracking one of the 100-year-old bottles of wine, but decided to avoid eating or drinking anything we didn't bring down with us. Maybe I would sneak one back up though. I walked towards his desk, curious at what I would find, but my foot caught something on the floor and I tripped. I regained my balance and checked what it was. There was a latch handle and a metal square that looked a lot like a trapdoor. It occurred to me then that we were right underneath the elevator. My God, did the hole go deeper? I had assumed that we had hit the bottom, but what if it kept going, and this trapdoor led to it? Curiosity took over and I pulled at the latch, lifting the door. No explosions and no booby traps. There was a short metal staircase leading to a small viewing platform. I climbed down onto it and saw at the far end there was a black iron spiral staircase leading down further. Jesus, how much deeper did this go? I peered over and saw the staircase didn't drop much further than about 10 feet. Below me was what looked like a large cement floor. It was smooth and encased the entire bottom of the tunnel, going right to the edges of the wall. This was the bottom, I suppose. I had reached it, and I was standing somewhere only one of the most evil men in history had stood. But on the cement floor, there was a large, perfectly rectangular chunk of granite in the center. It reminded me of what you would find on the lid of a sarcophagus, but far thicker. It stood about a meter off the ground. I descended the staircase, keeping focus on the heat and any possible tripwires or explosives, but there weren't any. This place was bare. I stepped down into the cement floor. It wasn't actually cement, but something similar. It looked naturally formed, like some kind of heat-absorbing foam that had hardened over the ages. The granite lid was what looked most out of place. It was black, unlike the grayish-white foundation underneath it, and it looked to be over a ton. Why was it sitting perfectly symmetrical in the center of this odd basement? How did they get it down here? Or had it always been here? My mind kept pulling up the image of the lid of a tomb, and some ancient being waiting under it to be brought back, which was silly, wasn't it? I approached it, my flashlight catching something on top of the lid. Carvings. There were words chiseled into the granite. I inspected them but couldn't make any out. They looked more like symbols from dead language or languages. But at the very center of the block, carved over the other, nonsensical gibberish, was a phrase that I recognized as a modern language. It was hacked into the rock in German. Halle auf Erden. I had no idea what that meant, but I took a mental image of it. Is this where he kept his final weapon? Below his final stand? I put my hand on the rock to test for heat, but found that the mass had shifted under my pressure. The lid moved a few inches from my touch. I applied more pressure, and found the rock was easier to move than a piece of paper. Curious, I decided to shift it further. The lid slid away from me, a loud crack coming from under it like rock breaking. What was revealed under the lid was something I could only describe as a world-changing event. There was a body in a coffin-shaped drop floor. Under the body, rock was cracking and crumbling away, as if cued by the lid opening. The body was a man, and was wearing a 1945 German chancellor's uniform. He held a Luger in his right hand across his body, and a copy of Mein Kampf in his left. He was old when he had died. In its 80s it looked like, but well preserved. There was no question who it was. He still had his stupid mustache and haircut, though it had grayed during his elder years down here. My mind raced. Was it one of Hitler's doubles that supposedly took the fall for him in Berlin? Or was this one of them? No, this was him. The second that I saw his face, I knew it was him. This is no double. I needed to sit down, but the ground under Hitler's body cracked again, this time splintering and dropping away. Red light from below began to seep up through the rock. The drop floor under him had collapsed and Hitler fell with it. Red light and heat burst through the opening, filling the tunnel. What was down there? I peered over the edge, down through the opening, and saw everything I never wanted. I saw fire, brimstone, and writhing masses of bodies clawing at each other. Waves of amber sprayed down on them. I saw erupting volcanoes spewing out more screaming bodies as they were scorched by flames. The fire moved like a living organism, lashing at the bare backs and chests. I saw faceless people burning in vast lakes of boiling water, while large winged creatures picked at them from the skies. Miles and miles of it. It was endless. I saw a being in the far, far distance. It stood amidst the erupting volcanoes, taller than any building, whose head disappeared in the dark red clouds above. A sound emerged from it, shaking the bodies and creatures down below. The glass on my protective mask cracked. As if on cue from the being, the bodies and creatures turned their attention up towards me and the opening. They started rushing up towards me, clawing and pulling, anything to get away from the fire and the pain. Another wave of heat hit me. It was immediately unbearable, but I couldn't move. My whole body went full rigor mortis. I stared down, my mask melting away, into the depths of hell. And it stared back up. I got movement back, grabbed the granite lid and tried to slide it over the opening, but it wouldn't budge. I got behind it with all of my weight, but nothing. It was too heavy now. I looked back down and saw the winged creatures flying up towards the opening. The charred bodies of forgotten people were piling on top of each other, creating a mountain of flesh, crawling and gnawing and mashing over one another to reach me and the way out. I saw Hitler, skinless and on fire amongst them. I tried to push the lid again, but it was solid and unmoving. It was open now, and it wasn't closing. I rushed back to the staircase, red light and heat filling the chamber. I darted through the tunnel, climbed out of the wall panel and out into the weapons hall. I had to get out. I had to get to the elevator. No time to grab anything. No time to warn anyone. There was no time for anything. I had to get up, and I had to collapse the tunnel from the top. But I had to get out first. As I turned out to the hallway, I saw ash and cinder filling the armory behind me. It was coming. I rushed out to the one elevator and saw Sullivan just coming out of the dormitories. He looked confused, like he had just woken up. His eyes went wide when he saw the flames starting to fill the compound. I didn't have time to wait for him or anyone. I shut the gate and punched the elevator up at full blast. We lurched upward and pulled away. I watched Sullivan burst into flames as crowds of burning bodies poured into the hallway, piling onto him. The elevator moved fast. The fire was still down on the bottom level, but it was slowly climbing the elevator shaft. I was gonna be in this one until the next switch, which would take 10 minutes. I just hoped that I would make it, and that the metal framing for the elevator would hold out. We made it to the next switch, and I moved fast up through the platforms and onto the second last elevator. This would bring me up to 4 kilometers from the surface, assuming that I made it. As the elevator shot up the tunnel, I watched the platform that I had just been on collapsing into the engulfing flames. Screams echoed up from the ever-growing cloud of fire that filled the tunnel with the reek of sulfur, or as it was previously called, brimstone. I got to the final switch and rushed up to the second platform, but the elevator to go up was gone. They had brought it up. I was stuck here. I looked down and saw the fire rising up the elevator shaft. It couldn't be less than 100 yards away now. But then I remembered the second tunnel up. It would be Titan 4 kilometers of cardio, but I would at least survive. But that would take me hours to climb, and the fire would overwhelm the surface long before I got there. Unless I blew the tunnel. That was it. The explosives were on every level, and I had seen them on each switch. It hadn't just been through the mountain. The Germans had prepared for this exact situation. I rushed over to the edge of the tunnel. The heat waves rushing up caused my suit to simmer. My arms burned and I felt the plastic melting to my skin. I bit down and saw the controls for the tunnel explosives. Everything was written in German, but operated similar to the mechanics of a kitchen timer. I quickly set it for 1 minute and rushed across the platform to the far side of the tunnel. I opened the large metal door to the footpath up and slammed it shut behind me. The footpath up was more like a spiral staircase, minus these stairs and very tight and low, like a twirling crawl space. I was essentially crawling upwards on all fours in an upwards right lane. My arms burned from the plastic, but I tried not to pay any attention to them. I felt the explosion go off and the walls pressing my shoulders inward shook. I waited for everything to collapse and cave in on me. I waited for the heat to rise up behind, for the sulfur to fill my nostrils. I kept climbing, waiting for something to stop me, but it didn't. I had no idea how much further it was or how far I had gone. What if somewhere up there it had collapsed? The thought of crawling back was terrifying, but there wasn't anything to crawl back to. I'd have to dig through it all or just give up. The lower tunnel would have collapsed, and with any luck, the final stretch of the elevator shaft would have too. I would know soon enough if they did. I climbed, pulling myself up non-stop for what felt like hours. Time disappeared and then I smelt it. The sulfur. I turned back and caught the faint glow of red drifting up behind me. It was coming up the backup path. I scrambled faster, pulling myself up while the heat behind me got closer. The sulfur became overwhelming, and I saw ambers dancing and jumping behind me. Voices screamed up from the flames, echoing around me. But then there was light up ahead. It was fluorescent, the kind that the military used. I was almost there. I climbed out into the main cavern exhausted, my body drained and empty of energy, but I sprinted through the foliage to the main tunnel out. I got to the first explosive, turned back and saw the fire and bodies spilling out from the pathway. Sullivan was amongst them. He was just barely recognizable, charred to a crisp. He saw me, and a horrific screech bellowed from him. I cranked the timer to 20 seconds and sprinted through the pathway. My only hope was the explosives were still linked together and worked. As I burst out of the tunnel and into the freezing night, an earth-shattering series of explosives shook the ground beneath me, and I was thrown across the frozen landscape by the shockwave. I landed on the snow hard, but got up and kept running. I couldn't feel my arms or legs, and I had fallen into some kind of flow state of movement. I couldn't stop until I was back at the first camp, and on my way to Novo Air Base. I wouldn't sleep until I was on a plane back stateside. I turned back and looked at the mountain that I was just below. The massive rock and granite splintered and had collapsed inward on itself. I hoped that would be enough. The first camp got me on a snowmobile and moved me to the airport. While waiting for my flight, I had my first moments of calm and began dissecting what had happened. The words had carved into the lid, the ones I actually recognized as language, haunted me. Halle auf Erden. I wrote the words out on a napkin and looked up a translator on my phone. It was indeed German, and it translated to Hell on Earth. So that was it. That was his final weapon. Hitler was going to unleash eternal hell on the rest of us. Or was he? Had he in his elder years decided not to break the barrier? Had he found some kind of peace? Or did he leave himself there to be found someday, so that the discovery of his body could lead to this, and everyone would know who was responsible? I'm not sure that I'll tell anyone, or I'll make something up, like the tunnel became unstable and it caved in. But what if I didn't stop it? I collapsed a mountain on it. I prayed that would be enough to bury it all. But that granite lid, whatever it was what separated hell from earth, and it was gone now. I wonder how long it'll take to burn through the mountain and up into our world.